Columbia, thanks for joining us. Wisconsin, awesome. Oh, Florida. Okay, we got a perfect cross-section across the country, I think.
We're geographically represented.
Representation matters. So,
That's right.
Hurrah for that.
So you came in to Portland, Alexis, and here it is raining. We had big enough winds last night that it knocked over a tent in my backyard, my picnic table tent, bent over the picnic table umbrella. I don't know. Did you experience any of that wind?
Didn't notice. Maybe I slept extra hard, so.
Yeah, I didn't notice it either, but I woke up this morning and there was tents strewn throughout the neighborhood, so it must have been big winds.
I heard the power went out in a few places.
Yeah. Just added to the mix of 2020 in Portland. It's been a nutty year here.
That's for sure. At least we're counting down towards the last part of it.
Yeah, no doubt. Can't wait. All right, so... Well, it's weird. It's capped at 100 people or something. I don't know if there's more people trying to join, but I think we'll kind of get started here. There we go. There's a big surge. Okay, so we're gonna get started. Thanks for coming to this session today, folks. The way this is gonna work is we have an hour. I'm gonna introduce the session. Then I'm gonna introduce myself. And then Alexis is going to introduce herself. And then I'm going to give a presentation for 20 minutes or so. Alexis will do the same. And then we'll do Q&A. And so we might just opt to just banter with each other and hope that you all enjoy what we talk about, because it's going to be about the session topic that you are going to hear about now. So, all right. So I'll start off with the session topic. So the session topic today is to talk about, generally speaking, the nuts and bolts of zoning issues and kind of pragmatic issues as it relates to the legalities and zoning and costs and et cetera of dwelling in somebody else's backyard in a mobile dwelling. And so I call it mobile ADUs because I'll go into my intro here, because my forte is accessory dwelling units. This is a book that I wrote, Backdoor Revolution, The Definitive Guide to ADU Development. And so that's really my passion and expertise. And I do that work nationally. I do consulting for jurisdictions and AARP and states on ADU-related legislative issues and consulting and certifications and classes and stuff for ADUs. However, I also have one leg firmly implanted in the tiny house world. I own the first tiny house hotel in the country, Tiny Caravan, the Tiny House Hotel in Portland, Oregon. And I'm very interested in kind of the crossover of the allowance of mobile dwellings in residential backyards. And so I'm going to talk more about that specifically. And a study that I did on that topic and give you guys some interesting data points to work with. So that's kind of the scope of the session and a little bit of an introduction about myself. Alexis, you froze. Oh no, don't freeze. Bad timing. All right. Well, Alexis, when she becomes unfrozen, there she is. Are you? Okay.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, good deal. Hopefully, internet stays stable. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Alexis Stevens. I'm the co-founder of Tiny House Expedition, which is a documentary and community education project. I'm also the co-creator of the documentary series called Living Tiny Legally, which you can access on our website, tinyhouseexpedition.com. And it covers a lot of the legal obstacles and ways those are being overcome. And we are actively working on part 3, which will show the next wave of progress and hopefully less challenges for our movement. I also sit on the board of directors for the Tiny Home Industry Association, which is the leading advocacy association in the country. And we partner with the American Tiny House Association, which is now focusing more on education and fundraising to help everyone with their combined efforts of promoting the acceptance and placement of tiny homes.
Awesome. All right, so you're dealing with two subject matter experts here, and we are excited to share some interesting insights with you, and we'll get started. So Alexis is going to disappear. I'm going to share my screen, and then she'll come back out in 20 minutes. All right, so hopefully this all works, and Alexis is going to confirm in a minute here. Okay, that doesn't look right on my end. Does that look right on your end, Alexis? Are you seeing like... This is what I want to be. I want to be showing a blog post. Are you seeing a blog post, Alexis?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. So I did not put together a formal presentation. I'm just going to refer to these various tabs that I have open on a web browser, and hopefully you all can see it. So this is accessorydwellings.org, which is a website that I run, which is kind of a group blog about ADUs. But I want to focus in on specifically one post that I recently wrote 6 months ago at the inception of coronavirus pandemic in the Kol neighborhood where I was living. I took the opportunity when you could do nothing else to bike around all the roads in one neighborhood. And this one neighborhood has 12,500 residents, 4,600 households. There's incidentally about 25 to 27 miles of roads in this one neighborhood. Who knew? There were so many roads. And the intent of my study was to look at how many inhabited mobile dwellings there were in this neighborhood. This neighborhood is kind of it's in Portland, which is kind of already known as a tiny house mecca, and then this neighborhood in particular is a really good neighborhood for tiny homes in that it's got small dwellings on large lots. So it's a little bit better than the average neighborhood in terms of being tiny house friendly, just because of the nature of the lots themselves. But in any case, I decided it would be interesting to survey how many inhabited mobile dwellings there are. Now, I'm going to just go through this, the kind of the methodology of the study that I did. And this is an informal study. I just did this together myself. And by the way, the reason I'm going through this is because I'd love it if other people did this exact same study in their neighborhood. Take a defined geographic area and go through every single residential property in that neighborhood on bike or on foot and determine whether or not there's a tiny house in the backyard. Short of it is, I'll just jump to the results right now so that I can then go through the methodology a little bit more, but I want to share the results first because I don't want to bore you guys with too much of the methodology before I get to the results. So in the end, what I discovered was in these 4,600 some odd inhabited or residential properties, there was 36 inhabited RVs, recreational vehicles, and 29 inhabited tiny houses on wheels, which gives us a density rate of 0.005 mobile dwellers per residential property, mobile dwellers on residential properties per resident. So that is kind of the end result of the survey, which, is just kind of a data point that is worth noting. Obviously, it's only one data point, and that only becomes useful and relevant if many other neighborhoods in the country are surveyed, and we can start to be like, why is there so few or so many mobile dwellers on these residential properties in Kol? But the other interesting data point that I want to put out there for people's consideration is to compare mobile dwellings, which were on these residential properties, versus ADUs. Now, ADUs, we know statistically speaking that Portland is actually whether or not it's actually a tiny house capital, we can't prove that because there isn't a lot of records of, permitted records about how many people are living in mobile dwellings. But we do know for a fact that Portland is a leader nationally on ADUs. And yet, in this exact same neighborhood boundary, I discovered in my analysis of ADUs in Portland that there are only 60 ADUs in this neighborhood. So despite the fact that there are We are known as a ADU Mecca, as exemplified by all these blue dots on this page. Nonetheless, we have more tiny houses on wheels and more RVs in that same neighborhood than we do ADUs, which is really interesting because as much as ADUs are talked up now in California and Oregon, and rightfully so, and I am a huge ADU advocate, maybe one of the biggest ones in the country. Nonetheless, even though tiny house on wheels and RVs are not even legal really to live in, they are more inhabited and more frequent and more common than ADUs in the ADU Mecca in the country, which is really interesting. Why in the heck is that, right? Rhetorical question. Why is that? Well, as I put in this post here, a quote from James Carville, it's the economy, stupid. It's pretty obvious why they're more popular. It's because they're less expensive. That is why they are more popular. People are willing to risk the fact that they aren't necessarily legal to live in on residential properties because, unlike an ADU, which costs 180, statistical average is about $210,000 to build an 800 square foot ADU right now. Love them. Don't get me wrong. Huge ADU advocate. Nonetheless, tiny houses are vastly less expensive than that. And to go even further still, I would say that, as much as tiny houses on wheels are great because they are so affordable, we're talking $50,000 to $100,000 for a tiny house on wheels completed. Those are vastly more expensive than what I found in my survey people are actually living in, more so than tiny houses, which are inhabited RVs. These are $10,000 or less in RVs that are for sale today in Portland on Craigslist. Look on Craigslist in your neighborhood and you will find there are $10,000 travel trailers that are available right now for purchase with bathrooms, with kitchens. And so I think the reason that this is interesting for me is because a lot of the work that I do around the country on ADU related education advocacy consulting with jurisdictions, I get feedback from those jurisdictions about how they want ADUs to be affordable and how that is why they want ADUs to take off, because they want them to solve the affordable housing crisis. And I'm like, you know what? That's awesome. ADUs are more affordable than the average single family residential house. But it's a lot more affordable than ADUs? Tiny house on wheels. It's a lot more affordable than that? RVs. And you guys are not allowing these forms of dwellings on residential properties. Yet people are willing to risk housing security and break the law in order to live in these things, presumably largely motivated by the fact that they are far less expensive than an ADU or a single family house. And so there's a real need for this stuff, as exemplified by this survey that I conducted. So now going back to the methodology of the survey, I wanted to go into that a little bit more so people who are interested in this can replicate it perhaps. So we talk about how many, the rate of these things that are in this one neighborhood. And then I linked to a photo album, and I'm going to start scrolling through some of these photos so you can see what these look like. Tiny house on wheels here, inhabited RV, and I'll just kind of breeze through these. And I want to tell you how I defined tiny houses or inhabited RVs, tiny house on wheels. Inhabited RVs versus non-inhabited RVs, because there's a lot of non-inhabited RVs out there. So to go into that for a second, if we look at inhabited versus non-inhabited RVs, the way I did it was I said if it was an inhabited RV, it would show several of these characteristics. It would have an extended pop out on the side of the RV. The curtains in the RV would be drawn. There would be a retracted step out, and there might be an active electrical connection. And furthermore, in some cases, there might be plumbing connected. Those would all be indications to me that if several of those things were there, or maybe there was like chairs outside the stoop of the doorway, that to me indicated it was inhabited. I did not go up to each neighbor and say, hey, is somebody living in that travel trailer? People would have eyeballed me weirdly. That would actually be a good thing to do, but I didn't bother doing that because just doing this initial survey took me like 20 hours or so. I didn't want to spend my whole life doing this survey. And then a non-inhabited RV by extension, or conversely, was something where there was no extension pop outs. The steps getting into the RV were not visible. There was no electrical connection. This is just an RV that's in somebody's driveway, so I didn't count that as an inhabited vehicle. So So that's kind of the difference between inhabited and non-inhabited. And then tiny houses on wheels in general were, inhabited. All right, so more about the findings of this survey. That's the methodology. There's also inhabited RVs on residential streets, and I did not count those. I was really just looking at inhabited RVs on residential properties. These are, this is, I guess, the interesting point to make here is that the reason in Portland, where there's, homelessness is an issue, that people are living on the streets is because there is no place for them to live in these, dumpy travel trailers in a legal manner. So they basically are just doing it in the public right of way. And so that's the option we're giving people. Live in a tent, a cardboard box, or a dumpy travel trailer on a street, because the next step up from that costs $1,000 a month, right? To live in a residential room in a property in Portland. So it's either you pay $0 a month to live on the street, or you pay $1,000 a month. But what if you have, say, $500 a month? Where do you live then? And the answer is, well, if we allowed for people to live in tiny house on wheels or travel trailers on residential properties, that would cost $500 a month. So this is neighbors. This is the neighborhood. This is the Kol neighborhood in Portland, just one neighborhood. And if you extrapolate this kind of dwelling occupancy rate across the city of Portland, in fact, you would find that there is 3,300 inhabited mobile dwellings in Portland right now, which is greater than the number of ADUs. Whether that's true or not, I can't say, because I only did this survey in one neighborhood. So I would encourage you to read through this post if you're curious. The other thing I wanted to talk about right now is another post that I did on mobile ADUs, which is talking about this concept that right now there is there's a couple different approaches being considered in different jurisdictions around the country to looking at how we can allow for mobile dwellings to be ADUs. You're going to hear more about that in a moment from Alexis, and then in the next session, you're also going to hear about that concept from Dan Fitzpatrick, I believe. But I want to kind of give a little bit of context for this concept, which is the notion that you can classify. So basically, think of from a regulatory framework, if we're thinking about the legalization of the habitation of tiny houses on wheels on residential properties, there's two large, perhaps two or more large different ways you can frame that. One is what is being experimented with right now in California that you'll hear about in a minute, which is classifying them as a form of ADU under a certain set of preconditions, that they're meeting certain building code standards, and that if you build one, then you can't also build a detached ADU because that is your detached ADU. That's one approach. That's perfectly cool. I'm glad to see that happening. It's awesome. It's working to some extent. That's great. But I think it doesn't actually address the bigger problem or the bigger opportunity, which is that tiny house on wheels are affordable, but they're not as affordable as travel trailers. And so if we're going to start to think about how tiny house on wheels are solving for affordability, then why aren't we going a step further still and actually solving for affordability by allowing not just tiny house on wheels, but any mobile dwelling, whether it's a travel trailer, an Airstream, a tiny house on wheels, a camper van, a schoolie, a vehicle. I don't care. These are all steps up from a cardboard box underneath a bridge, aren't they? And so, we have to really come back to what is the legislative intent or the intent of these policies. And I think I just want to get this conversation to be more inclusive of thinking about, what we're trying to do when we're thinking about allowing for mobile dwellings on residential properties by just having one, framing it as it has to be, a stick-built, thing with wood clad. It has to be tiny house on wheels or a park rental RV. That's great because it's a step toward affordability, but it's not a step as far as what I think is actually worth exploring, which is, inhabited travel trailers, which, as I showed you, are available in your neighborhood for $10,000 right now. What Portland is doing right now, although they are not legal to live in Portland, they have done a temporary relaxation of the maintenance code which says, "Thou shalt only live in residential structures on residential properties." And so during the housing crisis, one of the commissioners in the city of Portland said, we're going to relax the enforcement of this maintenance code, and we're going to allow for, we're going to explicitly look the other way if we see people living in inhabited vehicles on residential properties. So you can live in a vehicle, an RV, a travel trailer, tiny house on wheels. All those are fine for now because we're in a housing crisis. And so the Building and Life Safety Department is not going to bust you if you live in one of these dwellings on a residential property right now. Now, that's not a permanent regulatory fix. It's rather just an amnesty program. So I think that is a better approach. I think that is the approach that should be considered by jurisdictions that are looking at this problem of how can we enable tiny house on wheels on residential properties. And I think that is a concept that I want Portland to double down on. And I want them to not only say, we won't look the other way, but to have a set of development regulations say, okay, if we're going to do this, we're going to require a sewer connection, or we're going to require a 5-foot setback, or it has to be, X number of feet from the front property line. Any of these, design or siting standards, I think are reasonable things to think through. But I think the fundamental distinction here that I want to offer is this is the approach that we're exploring here in Portland is kind of a deregulation of camping, looking at tiny houses as a camping. And incidentally, camping, whether or not you realize it, you might not be allowed to legally camp on your own residential property, which seems stupid, and it is stupid, but you can't. And so it's really, when we're thinking about tiny house legalization, it might actually be useful for us to start thinking about this in the framework of camping codes on residential properties, rather than looking at them, as tiny house on wheels as something that could be stuffed into the ADU realm. As I said, I'm totally comfortable with the notion that we should be experimenting with all these different approaches right now. But I think those two frameworks are useful to explore and to think about and to consider as we deliberate on how to enable tiny house on wheels to be legal, viable forms of dwellings on residential properties. If you are interested in learning more about tiny house on wheels site development and a permitted pathway to do legal, legitimate infrastructural connections to tiny house on wheels, at least in Portland. This is my case study of having done so in Portland. I got a legal 50 amp 50 amp electrical connection. Then I got a legal RV connection for wastewater and a legal water hookup. And then we put a tiny house on, or actually we didn't put the tiny house on wheels in our backyard. People who owned a tiny house on wheels brought it into our backyard. And so they paid us rent for parking on our property. So we put in, $3,000 to $5,000 of cost in site improvements, and they paid us, $500 a month in rent or so to live there. So this is their tiny house on wheels, and great deal for them, great deal for us. Very good return on investment, very rational, far better return on investment than an ADU would be. So that's a case study about how to do that, which is linked from this blog post on buildinganadu.com, the birth and evolution of mobile ADUs. So feel free to check that out. And then lastly, I'll just mention that in my book, Backdoor Revolution, The Definitive Guide to ADU Development, the last chapter of this book is called Accessory Dwellings and Civil Disobedience, and deals with this conversation. At least it teases up the conversation that this is something that's coming down the road, hopefully before too long. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to wrap up my portion of the presentation. I'm going to stop sharing and make myself visible again.
There's one question that I think you just kind of already touched on, which is, are there investment opportunities with mobile ADUs? And I think you just kind of mentioned that on the return on investment for your own property.
Yeah, absolutely. So not only is there really good, there's really good business opportunities, obviously, for individuals who want to do it. It's an extremely rational thing to do. But I want to actually point you to another business that is doing something really cool. Sorry, it's just taking a minute here. There we go. Okay, so this is a business based. Ugh. All right, I'll find it eventually. I don't want to I don't want to take too much time, but there is a business now in Portland that is leasing out. Basically, they'll lease out your backyard and put a tiny house on wheels in the backyard, and will give you rental income. Like 2/3 of the rental income goes to them, 1/3 goes to you. That's a really cool, innovative business model. It doesn't cost you any money as a homeowner, and you get a few $100 each month. And boy, I mean, that's the kind of innovate. And then furthermore, like let's say you, the homeowner, get bored and sick of hosting a tiny house on wheels. No big deal. We'll take it away. That is such a cool thing. And that model has been experimented with in the ADU space. But unlike an ADU, tiny house could be extracted anytime. So there's no like long-term commitment. So it's way better in many regards than doing that same business model with an ADU.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. Well,
all right. So I'll hide myself unless there's another question.
Okay, good deal. And I'm going to share my screen.
I don't know how to hide myself. How do I hide myself?
At the bottom, you could push. You can mute yourself and turn off your camera.
Okay.
Okie dokie. All right, that was excellent presentation with Kol, and I hope to add to that with a little bit of insight on regulations in other places, primarily California, and some practical insights from my own experience. So, movable tiny houses is another popular term for tiny houses on wheels. Same idea. It's just maybe formalizing it a bit. But movable tiny houses as accessory dwelling units are picking up significant momentum in zoning around the U.S. California is knocking it out of the park, but other places, including Colorado and Massachusetts and Washington, are also taking steps in that direction. So as of now, the whole state of California is ADU friendly. ADUs are allowed across California, and now in all their major cities, movable tiny houses are also allowed as ADUs, and a number of counties have accepted them as well, and many, many more are in the works. The Tiny Home Industry Association president, Dan Fitzpatrick, is leading the way in these talks, and he's going to be speaking next, so I highly encourage you to tune into his presentation, and he can tell you more about what's in the works there and other places in the country. But these are the list of cities and counties where it is allowed now. Fresno was the first, as many of you know who've watched our film Living Tiny Legally. That was now about 5 years ago, believe it or not. And it took a long time for that to be replicated, but now it has been. And the one thing that I've learned in my documentary work is that cities don't like to reinvent the wheel. So as soon as one person does it, they have something to look to replicate their own local zoning ordinance. But now what's so great about this wide array of places in California is we have big cities, we have smaller cities, we have counties, including very rural counties. So now we have this menu of options that are very similar, but they have a few little differences among them, so that, someone, if you go to your city and you say, oh, look what LA has done. Well, depending on the size and feel of your city, your local planning department might not be thrilled about hearing about LA. But maybe San Luis Obispo, which is a much smaller city, would be a better example. So those are some things to think about when you go to your city, is even though these are very similar zoning ordinances in these places, finding a community that's most similar to yours will help you in your advocacy efforts. And of note here on this list, Sonoma County, right now, you can get a permit for a tiny house or RV, I believe, as a caregiver unit. So that's very specific use. So a caregiver would be for medical reasons is the main one. And then also Santa Rosa and Petaluma have like an emergency ordinance where you can get a permit for up to 5 years for placement of a movable tiny house. Now, because they're so mobile, that's great that in 5 years, if that sunsets, they can move. Now, 5 years, we all know, goes by really quickly. So will those people be in a bind? Possibly. But now, since that went into effect, all these other places are doing it. By the time that sunset comes around, it'll probably be much easier to extend it or to create a permanent zoning ordinance. So as I mentioned, in California, the zoning ordinances are very similar. They rely heavily, on RV building standards and fire codes. So the problem with that for a lot of other cities and other states in particularly is RV codes can deal with a canvas-sided structure, right? So it's not the same quality as a residential structure. And that's something that the industry association is looking at right now, is how do we create our own subset standard that's a step up from the RV, but creates more flexibility possibly than the International Residential Code. But what they've done is they define a movable tiny house as distinct from RV, because I'm on board with Kol personally. I love what Portland has done, and I want it to be more inclusive of different kinds of mobile structures. The reality is that there's a lot of pushback about RV dwelling. And so the idea behind distinguishing it between an RV was to create requirements around the trim, the siding, the roofing material and style, so that basically it resembles a cottage, it resembles a traditional ADU or a residential structure, just on a little scale. The other thing is, all these units must be connected to city, water, electric, and sewer. So there are hookup fees associated with that. And some cities have, across California, they've really taken a look at how to reduce those fees to encourage ADU development, period, including movable tiny houses. Because the reality is, in other places, someone touched on this in the comments, where ADUs are allowed, those hookup fees can be so significant that it discourages development. So San Luis Obispo is a little bit different. In their city, they have a requirement that the primary structure must be owner occupied, right? So in other cities, they don't have that requirement. That means the main house could be a rental, but in this case, the owner must live in the house. So that's limiting, right? But the application hookup fees are only around $1,800. Maybe, I do feel like I heard, and this is something I want to look back into, because I do feel like I heard, no, it was in a different city. In a different city, I'm sorry, I just can't place it right this moment. I believe it was as much as $5,000, which is much less, believe it or not, than hookup fees in a lot of places, but still kind of cost prohibitive. And I know that's something that the American Tiny House Association wants to help with, which is fundraising to help get people placed in cities where it's already allowed, but where that fee can be cost prohibitive for people. And in this city also, you can get a permit for 3 to 5 years, which can then be renewed. Unlike most ADUs where it's an indefinite period. Oh, I wanted to show you guys, let me get out of big screen. Before we move on, I wanted to reference LA's zoning ordinance for ADUs, which has sections for movable tiny houses. And this ordinance is what's most widely being copied in other places. So as you're going to see in here, it says that a movable tiny house must be licensed and registered with the DMV. Okay, and like I said, it must meet either the ANSI or NFPA standards, which are typically for RVs. And they have the size limitations between 150 and 430 square feet. So for instance, my 130 square foot tiny home wouldn't fit in their regulation. Maybe I could get a exception. I don't know, probably not. Okay, then further in the ordinance, they break down the requirements for movable tiny houses as ADUs. And I know I'm going over this kind of quickly, so I want to let you know that if you want to look into detail on this, that you can go to the Tiny Home Industry Association.org to read more thoroughly on your own time. But in this LA ordinance, they break down specifically more of the requirements, such as skirting, which they say the undercarriage must be hidden from view. So, which is almost kind of silly, because if it's in a backyard, no one's going to be seeing the undercarriage who doesn't already live on the premises. But nonetheless, you got to hide the part that makes it mobile. They don't want to see it. Other interesting things is the requirements that separate it from an RV. It doesn't say that, but that's the intention, where it says movable tiny houses shall have the following design elements. This is intended to distinguish it from a traditional RV. So for instance, a roofing has to have a minimum pitch. Basically, they don't want any flat roofs like you see on RVs. That's the intention behind that. Cladding and trim should exclude single-piece composite, laminates, or interlocking metal sheathing. Basically, if you think of RV siding, they don't want your tiny house to have that because they want it to look like a traditional residential structure. All right, let me pop back over. Here we go. Here we go. All right, so why are we so passionate about tiny houses on wheels or other mobile structures as ADUs? Well, Kol already touched on this. It's just practical, it just makes sense. And very importantly, it's a win-win situation for the primary homeowner and the tiny dweller. So we're utilizing available land, available infrastructure, and the tiny house rent is going to go towards helping pay the mortgage, potentially, the property taxes, the maintenance of the property. It's significant financial benefit to have a couple to several $100s going towards the primary homeowner. And that money is that lot rent, so to speak, is significantly less than most market rate one bedroom or studio apartments. Right now in the country, it's almost impossible to find an apartment for, let's say, $300 at this point. Maybe you can rent a room in some places for that much, but it's few and far between. But yet, so many people exist on minimum wage income, or even, the good job I used to have where, I think I made it to $40,000 at a marketing agency in a small city. Well, I'll tell you what, that doesn't really go that far, when it comes to the rental market and what's available. And I think a lot of people struggle with this. And of course, as Kol touched on, it's very easy to fall into homelessness, especially now. Most of us have been there, one paycheck away. And this is where a mobile ADU can help stabilize the tiny dweller, and it can also help stabilize a homeowner that's maybe on the brink of not being able to meet their financial commitments. All right, so this is my tiny house, currently parked in the Bend area in Oregon. And full disclosure, I'm in an unpermitted parking situation. So I'm an unpermitted ADU. And for me, it's a form of civil disobedience. Christian and I take a lot of personal responsibility. We try to be the best neighbors we can be. We take care of the property. We keep it clean. We're neighborly. We're not loud. All these things, because we know this isn't fully legal. We take the extra responsibility, very, it means a lot to us to be good neighbors, basically. So the reality is, in most places, code enforcement is on a complaint basis. So one neighbor could call in a complaint or a passerby, and that could be it. We could need to be gone, within 48 hours to 60 days, depending on how the process goes. If you're ever in this situation, be sure you look up the procedures and make sure proper procedure is followed when it comes to code enforcement, appeals process, and that sort of thing, because some people get the short end of the stick, and it's not really where intimidation is used. That's not always the case. But if you are going to take on the risk, like what we did is we looked for a neighborhood that felt safe to us. We did our own informal survey of the neighborhood. We saw RVs with slide outs out in multiple places in our neighborhood, and we thought, it's a pretty good chance people are living in those, which means there's a comfort level in this neighborhood with that. And so far, we haven't had any problems. Whether you're in a unpermitted or permitted situation, it might be helpful to have some kind of agreement with your host. I use the term host. That's the primary property owner, or the primary homeowner, the property owner. And in our case, the homeowner is the property. The homeowner lives in the main house, and we have an informal set of rules that we've agreed to. We pay $310 a month, which includes all utilities, and also includes having to upgrade to a larger trash can. That's where the $10 came from. In a previous parking situation, we came up with a parking agreement. So this would be similar to a lease agreement that you would have for an apartment, but because it was unpermitted, it was a more formalized agreement. We put in writing the rules and the guidelines that we both signed and agreed upon. So not legally enforceable, but it's a nice way to set clear expectations. So we laid out what our monthly rent was going to be, what was an inclusive of, even mentioned that there might be occasional work trade opportunities with some babysitting. We talked about where we're going to park our car, how long we anticipated staying, how to deal with trash and recycling, communication, conflict resolution, how that was going to happen. We did some general guidelines along that, and I highly encourage you to do something similar if you do this kind of situation, because what I found is that most tiny house dwellers who have any kind of conflict with their homeowner, with their host, is because clear expectations haven't been set from the start. Communication is everything in life. I will say, in my current situation, we have fantastic communication with our hosts. We're very respectful. We typically text before, knocking on someone's door, that sort of thing. If an issue comes up, we address it right away. And there's lots of informal benefits that we have in our situation. For instance, we'll watch each other's pets, or when our host broke his arm, we were able to fill in with extra yard work that was needed. So that's what I really love about the situation, is that community feel, that neighborliness. And I'm completely with Kol in that I feel that the more loosening of regulations that we can do around the country for mobile habitation will greatly help reduce the number of people who wind up on the streets, no matter their circumstances. And with that, I would love to bring Kol back on and for us to answer questions.
Awesome. That was really cool. So, Alexis, what would be the best name like one or two websites that you'd recommend for people who are interested in learning more about, the legalization of tiny house on wheels on residential or just in general, your work on that, but also just other resources, just so everybody gets that in their head.
Yeah, that's great. Please check out tinyhouseexpedition.com. That's where you can find Living Tiny Legally and some other advocacy news, parking tips and guides, legal or otherwise. And then, of course, please check out the Tiny Home Industry Association website for all the latest news on what's happening, how you can be involved or become a member.
Okay. And we're always going to, poop is inevitably always a big question. So what do you do with the sewage on your residential property, Alexis?
Okay, so in lots of ADU situations that we've been in that are unpermitted, we've been able to have a sewer hookup, especially places that have like RV spots. Currently, that's not the case. We dispose of with under agreement with our homeowner. We dispose of it via the dump.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that let me just talk about this a little bit. In my mind, so if we're talking about first of all, let me just use some vernacular so people get familiar with this vernacular. Informality and formality and formal permitted stuff is kind of like right now the tiny house stuff and what we've been talking about is for the most part pretty informal. But what Alexis and I are talking about is like formal development regulatory frameworks for the legal habitation of mobile dwellings on residential properties. This is just terminology that you can start to think about. And when you're going to enter into that conversation, inevitably something is going to come up about waste. And I would say as a practical matter, it is unreasonable for us advocates to think about pursuing. I think it's probably unreasonable for us to think about promoting composting as a viable, legal, acceptable option right now, maybe down the road. And rather, I think coming up with some alternative frameworks for that. For example, can the occupant of the mobile dwelling have access to a bathroom, at least on paper, in the primary house? Can the occupant of the tiny house have a black water holding tank as a viable option? Can the occupant of the tiny house have a legal RV sewer connection, which is what I did on my residential property? Those to me seem like viable approaches that would not cause an immediate backlash in a community where this concept was being floated. What do you think about that, Alexis?
I completely agree. There are a couple rare places in this country where you can have a legal composting toilet. It has very strict guidelines. Oregon is one of them, actually, believe it or not. I would gladly replace our toilet with a flush toilet if that was the requirement to be legal. No problem. And in fact, when we were building our tiny house, we were sure to have enough space that at some point we can replace our composting toilet with a traditional toilet. And I encourage anyone who's looking to build a tiny house to look at that space and make sure that you can do it. Because if you do want to be legal and permitted, it is going to be a requirement, period. And I think, Kol, you're so right. I feel like that's going to be the one sticking point in so many places. Let's just go with it. The most important thing is to get the acceptance for the habitation. And then down the road, we can work on how to expand that in ways that are even more environmentally friendly, potentially. But it's asking for a whole lot right now. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, and those are just, that's just Alexis, in my opinion. It's up for debate, but I think that, that's at least where the two of us come down on that particular issue. All right, let's turn to some questions from the chat box. And actually, I would like to invite Nick Mosley, who to ask for the mic. So Nick, do that whenever. I don't know how that works, but when you do that, we'll bring you out here. Because Nick did one of these California tiny house on wheels as a permanent ADU. So I'd like to hear about his experience.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, so while we're waiting for Nick to grab the mic, look for that. Nick is the CEO of California Tiny House. He and his father and his family business, along with Dan Fitzpatrick, helped get the Fresno ordinance passed. And he's now been a consultant for other cities in California around permitting procedures.
Okay. Well, it's not working for him, so that's a bummer. But if he can figure that out, so be it. All right. So Nick, look for hand next mic next to comment box. Anyway, whatever. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Okay. Let's see what other questions there are.
But definitely California Tiny House. Contact them about, of course, building a tiny house, but for insight on placing one, they do consulting, I believe.
Awesome.
Oh, and let's look.
I want to also, just for sake of kind of providing some language, I feel like when we have these conversations about new frameworks for things, it's important for people to start to understand terminology and agree to terminology. So I know that seems kind of wonky, but when in the ADU space, I've had to deal with this. ADUs doesn't mean additional dwelling unit, doesn't mean ancillary dwelling unit, it means accessory dwelling unit. I mean, at least in general. And so, it's accessory because it's secondary and it's a diminutive architecture to the primary dwelling. And that's the origin of that term. And most planners use it. So it's good to use common terminology so we can start to move the movement forward collectively. And in that note, I want to just clarify that in this conversation we are not talking about communities. I mean, that's a whole nother topic, great topic, lots of conversations about that. We're not talking about that today. We're only talking about basically one, maybe two, I mean, hopefully maybe more, but let's just say one tiny house on a residential property. Why is that so important? Because this country is absolutely dominated completely by residential properties. There are so many residential properties, and yet there's a significant regulatory barrier to enabling those residential properties to be used for this very obvious, intuitive use. Now, doing co-housing, communities, all that is awesome. That can be done. It's difficult, but it can be done in RV parks. I have one. I developed it. I know it can be done. Not to say it's not easy, but it can be done. But I think in terms of the broader opportunity to create, lower the cost of housing in the United States, the specific issue we're talking about is using them in basically a mobile ADU on a resident. How to use mobile dwellings on a residential property. Basically one. If we want to open up the conversation to saying, let's maybe not allow for more than one, that's awesome. But maybe let's all think about how do we just allow one on a residential property? You want to respond to that, Alexis?
Sure. First, in terminology, I do really like mobile ADU when we're talking about trying to be inclusive of multiple styles of mobile dwellings. Unfortunately, we have Lindsay requesting the mic. Unfortunately, right now, because our country is so big, we have different zoning ordinances that use slightly different tiny house terms. Movable tiny house has been used broadly in California, but otherwise, tiny house on wheels is the second most used term. Or sometimes what you'll find, like in Washington, is they'll say a tiny house can be on a chassis or can be on foundation. But you can't really go wrong with the term tiny house. Okay.
Oh my God. It's so meta.
Okay, people, we're doubled up here. There's Nick. Can you hear him?
I couldn't get my computer to
Barely.
actually get my videos, so I just FaceTimed Lindsay.
Can you hear him better
All right.
now?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you okay. So Lindsay, please turn him horizontal so we can see him a little bit better. And then Nick, we're going to hand you the mic here to talk for 1 minute about your experience with, tell us what do we need to know about the legal, your experience with making tiny house on wheels legal as ADUs. And Lindsay, put that as close to the video camera as possible.
Okay.
You mind, Lindsay, just take the video camera off and bring it down.
Okay. It's just a separate camera. There we go. Okay, people.
There we go.
All right. It's weird staring into a camera, but
It's okay.
I'll make this work, and I'll do it quick. I don't want to take your guys' time. It was my intention. We did just recently get an ADU, a movable tiny house, approved as an ADU in San Jose. That's California, obviously, which is phenomenal. We've also done 2 in San Diego, and we have a couple going to LA and a couple going to the Contra Costa County, Bay Area stuff coming up here real soon. But California has done some really great things. They've done some stuff that's not so great, but San Jose is a great example of a city that is just on point. They have an awesome checklist that a client can go through, that a company or a builder can go through. They made it very, very simple. The only permits that were required were just for the electricity and for the plumbing. And so for the electricity, instead of doing a permit that you do for a traditional house, we pulled a permit for an electrical vehicle, which the state of California right now gives you huge kickback on. And so the cost of that is next to nothing because it's 50 amps, guys. That's what we're powering these tiny houses with, which is the exact same amount of amps that you need to power, a Tesla or any of the other electric vehicles, which I can't name any of, I'm sure. So that was our electrical permit. Plumbing permit was very simple. It was under $1,000, and within this client, their story is they wanted to house their dad. He's retired. They didn't want him in a home, especially with everything going on in the country right now. And they've been waiting for almost 2 years for an ADU, which I thought was insane. But apparently in the Bay Area, 12, 16, 18, 24 months is totally normal. Wow. And from start to finish, from the day they talked to me till it got placed and sited, has only been 3 months.
What?
So 3 months, under $5,000 total.
Wow.
I mean, not including the house, obviously, but very, very low cost. I think their dad's probably moving in here in the next couple days. It's pretty exciting. Same thing with San Diego. They have a few other nuances in, fire areas. They require sprinklers, which most people think, how do you do sprinklers in a movable tiny home? No different than a regular home. They have to be hooked up to water. They're already hooked up to water in a backyard anyways. So, we try not to overthink things. But yeah, the process is great. The city's totally on board here. We've gotten very little kickback from virtually anybody.
Great comments. Nick, quick question. So in the California market, ADUs are, detached ADUs are going to cost $200 on the low end to $400 in, the Bay Area. Really expensive. How much do you, all in, how much would a homeowner anticipate spending to develop a mobile ADU in the areas you've worked?
So for the one that happened to be in San Jose, they were all in for $80,000. That's because of the house they chose. Could they have spent $100,000 on a tiny house and then had the additional costs? Yes, of course. Could they have gotten in at even lower, a house that's in the 40s, 50s, and been under 60,000? Yes, they probably could have done that too. So I would say very reasonably, even a really large tiny house, you're still spending under $200,000, and you can have something really nice, really big, multiple bedrooms. There are companies now that I've been in touch with that want to start up a program for leasing people's backyards. You mentioned that earlier, which kind of piqued my interest. I worked with another company, and there's a lot of really cool stuff happening right now, especially in California. But that's mostly what I track because I'm here.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Nick. Thanks for your comments. Great stuff.
Thanks, Lindsay.
And don't forget, we'll be talking the Nick and Lindsay show later on at, I think, 5 o'clock Pacific time.
All right.
Awesome. And Lindsay, while we got you, Lindsay, the next session is going to be about this topic too, correct?
Yeah, we're doing another angle and deep dive. It's really Dan Fitzpatrick, the one behind the scenes in writing the ordinances with the city officials, county, state. He's working with the state of Maine. Dan has a list the benefit of being on the board of Thea, we know where Dan's working before things even get passed. So, definitely Dan's the man to chat. Obviously, he didn't work alone, but he definitely comes with a lot of that. And he'll be coming up in 2 minutes. So I'm going to let you guys wrap up.
Awesome.
All right, thanks.
Lindsay, Alexis, closing comments from you.
Closing comments is do not discount backyards as a quality choice for living and investment. It's a win-win investment for both parties. A homeowner can be in for very little money. There could be really creative ways to get around those upfront costs. Partnering with some of these companies that Kol and Nick mentioned could be interesting to look at. But I know a lot of people have a vision of living in a tiny house on a single property. You can achieve that. First, live in a backyard at a low cost and save money towards that goal. That's much more realistic. So I just want to put that in there, is backyards can be a wonderful environment where you feel very private, but still have the amenities of having your own space.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, everybody, for participating, and stay on for the next session. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Bye.